in July 2006 to 30,000 farming families. This brought to an end over 3 decades of terrorist violence, which had taken a heavy toll of nearly 100,000 lives, displacement of thousands internally, and destruction of an immeasurable amount of valuable property. The defeat of the Tamil Tigers was achieved through the heroic rescue of nearly 300,000 Tamil civilians who were being used as a human shield, herded by the retreating LTTE forces from the northwest coast to the northeast coast of Sri Lanka for over 30 months, to be exploited for their labor, conscripted to replace fallen cadre, and finally form a human shield for the cornered tigers making a last stand behind high earthen bunks in Mullivaikara. The defeat of the Tamil Tigers and elimination of their leadership brought an end to all forms of terrorism resorted to by LTTE, including suicide terrorism. At the same time, restoring the most vital human right, that is the right to life for all Sri Lanka's 21 million citizens belonging to all of our constituent communities who were constantly targeted by the shadowy terrorists. The sea of 300,000 humans that sought refuge in government-controlled areas, including surrendering tiger cadres numbering around 12,000, had to be fed 1 million meals a day, sheltered, medically treated, and most of all reassured of their care and safety, as they had been brainwashed for the past 30 years by the LTTE that the Sinhalese, whom they considered to be the cruel enemy, would cause serious harm to them. Their needs were met by the authorities with the help of many countries, NGO, INGO, UN agencies, and civilian volunteers who gave of their time and skills. The streaming IDPs were processed temporarily, housed in government schools and institutions in the town of Romania, and moved to the relief villages set up in the Manic farm 22 miles away. The relief villages had primary health care centers, schools, welfare shops, banks, post offices, and places of religious worship. The conditions in these camps were much better than what was depicted in Western media reports, and far superior to those in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, as admitted by visiting officials from overseas. The enormous task of resettlement of the IDPs and the rehabilitation of the former Tamil Tiger cadres was soon set in motion as the authorities decided on a policy of restorative justice instead of retributive justice, forgiving most of the cadres who had been led astray by the LTTE leadership. Resettlement had to be preceded with the clearing of nearly 1.5 million landmines and unexploded ordnances planted haphazardly by the LTTE over 1,419 square kilometers of land, which were removed by the end of 2013, with the Sri Lanka Army completing 70% of the demining, whereas the UN estimated a time period of 10 years for this task. 11,758 ex-combatants have been reintegrated to society with new life skills, including 594 child soldiers who were able to resume schooling after completion of their rehabilitation program. 234 are currently undergoing rehabilitation, while 91 hardcore cadre have to face legal proceedings under judicial mandated custody. Resettlement of the IDPs in their former place of residence was carried out on a voluntary basis, along with a resettlement package
for all all Sri Lankans, you can look at Sri Lanka as a failed state. You can look at it from a rule of law perspective where every measurable aspect of a proper legal system has been destroyed, dismantled. For example, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was impeached illegally by many international legal observers. We can also look at other aspects of it. You can look at the culture of impunity that exists. You can look at the failure or the lack of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, basically every major civil rights that we will take, most of us will take for granted. That is one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at the conflict or the situation in Sri Lanka is from a dimension of two major communities, and there are many others, not just the Tamils and Sinhalese, as Amran pointed out. There's many significant pockets of different communities that do occupy the island. But you can look at this as two major communities who have coexisted for a very long period of time on the island. But since at least from a quote-unquote post-independence perspective, have not been able to do so. And the reasons are quite simple. So if you look at it from a perspective of two, for lack of a better term, two nations living in this island, then the perspective of Tamils, that existence is quite limited. There's a lack of protection for their language, their culture, their basic needs, their land, increasingly any sorts of freedoms that they have as freedoms or aspirations that have Tamils are under attack, and that's another way of looking at it. From an international perspective, if we look at Sri Lanka, and I can tell you the first time I met with Canadian diplomats, probably 25 years ago, the way it was laid out to me is that Sri Lanka is the pearl of the Indian Ocean. It is a friend of Canada. It is a friend of the West. It is a country that had a vibrant democracy. And we come to the situation 25 years later, and incrementally we see Sri Lanka losing, and I would argue it's lost any credibility internationally. So I think that is the context in which we can look at Sri Lanka, and the perspective that I want to present to you is of Sri Lanka and sort of the situation of post-war. And I specifically use the term post-war and not post-conflict. Is I want to kind of examine how this two-nation concept actually exists in Sri Lanka. I was actually quite intrigued by the title of this discussion today, Sri Lanka is Peace Sustainable? And the answer to this question is actually quite simple. Peace is not sustainable because peace was never actually attained in Sri Lanka. Even worse, the prospects for peace are less likely now than they were back in 2009. Because the Sri Lankan government really failed to capture the moment in which peace could have been achieved. Perhaps the most appropriate question for tonight's discussion is peace even attainable in Sri Lanka? And I think that's a very serious question that we need to ask. Sri Lanka is a very complex country with many different peoples residing under a unitary state structure. The Tamils have felt disenfranchised from the outset of Sri Lanka gaining independence. The disenfranchising emanated from laws that in effect made Sinhala the official language in Sri Lanka, Buddhism the official religion, colonization of traditional Tamil areas as common practice, Sinhala domination in politics and government, state-sponsored programs in which thousands of Tamils died, and tens of thousands internally and at times permanently displaced. This has also resulted in over 1 million Tamils rendered refugees in Sri Lanka, and many have left. Actually, the estimate is there's over 1 million diaspora Tamils around the world. It was clear to Tamils that the political arrangement post quote-unquote independence was not workable, and in effect failed to provide any meaningful protection for the Tamil people within the unitary Sri Lankan state. If anything, the reverse was true. State structures were used as tools to suppress the rights of Tamils and effectively silence them. The minority Tamil community was subjugated to majoritarian rule, and more recently, authoritarian rule. Tamils don't have any issues with Sinhalese per se as individuals. I think as communities, there's been a long history of coexistence, but there is a structural problem with the Sri Lankan state. Tamils demanded a more workable political structure in which their culture, language, and land and people could be protected. The Tamils demanded this through peaceful means, and subsequently since 1983 entered a bloody phase of armed conflict led by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil. In 2009, the armed civil war came to a tragic end, with both sides, the LTTE and the government of Sri Lanka, standing accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in the case of the Sri Lankan government, genocide. These heinous crimes are the subject of an investigation now mandated through the Office of the UN Human Rights Commissioner in Geneva, the Office of the US Human Rights Commissioner in Geneva. I've argued on many occasions that the end of the civil war did not bring about peace. Rather, it brought about a belligerent majoritarian rule that continues to ravage the entire island, thereby curtailing the rights of Tamils and others in a significant way. Despite 5 years since the end of the civil war, Tamils in the north and the east continue to live under military occupation. Some estimates have pegged civilian-military ratio to be 6 to 1, six civilians for every 1 soldier in the Bani region. The military are much more engaged in every aspect of civilian life, from running businesses to dairy production to even education. Tamils on the island cannot be at peace without being secure that their language, culture, land, and people are protected. If the political arrangement between Tamils and the majority community in Sri Lanka was unworkable prior to the civil war, it is considerably worse today. In such a context, it is imperative to recognize that Tamils do in fact have a right to self-determination, a right enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Sri Lanka, unlike Canada, has seldom made concessions for the good of its people, of all its people. There are no protections for religious-based education similar to the ones that exist between Quebec and Ontario. There is no bilingualism policy enshrined as rights to obtain government services in language of a civilian's choice. There are no protections to have judges, for example, and there's a very recent thing in Canada we've seen, be represented at the highest level where certain issues are decided. There's no specific protection for language, for the Tamil language or culture. And I could go on with a lack of accommodation of any form that enable Tamils to accept the tenets of the current Sri Lankan government framework. The Canadian political framework is based on concessions meant to protect certain communities and to build a country in which all of its people feel welcome, respected, and treated with equality. As Canadians, we can acknowledge that the nation-building process is one that still needs a great deal of work. In Sri Lanka, the concept of nation-building is not a concept that is accepted by the majority community. Sustainable and lasting peace, therefore, cannot be achieved until there is a new political arrangement based on some of the following premises. 1. Accountability. An absolute precursor to peace is a proper accountability mechanism that will look at serious violations of international law. Sri Lankan government's attempts at accountability are extremely disappointing, and I would say even quite offensive. Victims in Sri Lanka demand justice. These victims are not just Tamils, but also Sinhalese and Muslims. The government's often touted report of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission highlights the issue. The LLRC did not
is either minute or slightly larger than that. We have a large number of online supporters. We've done what I hope is some very effective activism on the issue of Sri Lanka and human rights over the years, but we are in number a very small organisation, an organisation which, although we try to be as global as possible, is based in London, as indeed I am, so I'm very lucky to be here. The Sri Lankan campaign was founded in 2009 because essentially there were a group of people in London, volunteers, some ethnically Tamil, some ethnically Sinhalese, and some with no links to Sri Lanka whatsoever, who wanted exactly what the topic of discussion today is: a sustainable peace in Sri Lanka. And working as they all did in the world of human rights, we knew that we were not on track for that. And so this is where I come in and where I address the subject of the matter today. I've been working on the Sri Lanka campaign since 2011, and what I feel is, having much to agree with what the previous speakers have said about whether or not what is happening in Sri Lanka can currently be constituted as peace, the question as to whether we can even maintain the status quo in Sri Lanka, I think the answer is yes, we can, but we're not on track. And I see two major problems which could lead us back towards a violent conflict in Sri Lanka. But as I will go on to explain, I'm not being alarmist here, and I'm not suggesting, as some in the government of Sri Lanka have been in recent months, that we're already seeing that. I do not think we are. So the two main problems I see in Sri Lanka, one is, as has previously been mentioned, the culture of impunity. But I think it's worth talking a little bit about that, because I came to Sri Lanka as a student of comparative politics, having worked on many countries around the world, and I've never really come across, and I've been to some pretty unpleasant places, I've never really come across somewhere like Sri Lanka in terms of the culture of impunity. So what happened, what we mean when we say that, is in 2009 some truly terrible things took place in terms of mass murder, mass rape, mass torture. That's no longer a matter of opinion, that is no longer just what NGOs are saying, that is the finding of now 4 different UN bodies. The panel of experts report, the report of Charles Petrie into the UN's own behaviour, and 2 separate reports mandated by the Human Rights Council, one in 2012 and one in 2013. It is clear what took place.
And they claim that the Tamils do not have rights. My question is, what rights do they not have that the other citizens of Sri Lanka have? As far as I know, the Constitution gives every single citizen of Sri Lanka, regardless of ethnicity, the same right. As regards the question of language, we heard so much about the Tamil language, the Tamil construct. The Tamil language is recognized as an official language in Sri Lanka. The Ministry of Language and Culture has a provision for both the Tamil language and the Sinhalese language. There is equality in the sense that they have the ability to deal with the government in whichever language they choose. Further, I'd like to point out, they talk about the Tamil rights. The Tamils, I'd like to state, do not live prominent. They are the majority in the north, but the 55% of the Tamils of Sri Lanka do not live in the north and the east. They live everywhere in the island. They obviously are enjoying the same rights as every other person who lives in the island. So this question of Tamil rights, is questionable. Then I would like to refer to one of the panelists who spoke about the so-called panel of experts, or what is called the Darusman report. Suffice it to say, when it comes to credibility, that in that report, at the start of that report, the panelists who wrote that report clearly state in that report, this report is not based on proven fact. It does not meet the standards of the UN. I will leave it at that, because if they themselves say that it is not factual, what is the credibility, I would like to ask. On the point of colonization of Tamil areas, what are they called the Tamil areas? Sri Lanka belongs, the areas in Sri Lanka belong to all its citizens. The very idea of designating area as Tamil or Sinhala is not feasible. It's a small island. everybody has the right to live anywhere they choose. That's a fundamental right. The freedom of movement is a fundamental right. And today they have it. As regards the claim of genocide of the Tamils, I would like to state that it has been rejected categorically by the UN and by other foreign embassies in the country. As far as the fate of Sri Lanka, I am in agreement with these speakers that the fate of the Tamils of Sri Lanka, as well as the other communities, depend on the citizens of Sri Lanka. They have to decide what is it that they want. How do they want to live? They should not be dictated to by people who are from Sri Lanka, who now are domiciled in other countries and have an opinion on how other people should live. They should inquire from the citizens of Sri Lanka, what do you want? And engage with them rather than provide obstacles to them living in peace. As far as accountability that was spoken about, accountability is for everybody. And even the UN says the accountability has to be on the part of the Sri Lankan authorities as well as the LTTE. As far as the LTTE is concerned, it was funded primarily by the Tamil diaspora. They funded the LTTE to terrorize people of Sri Lanka. So I ask you, are they not accountable to those who funded terrorism in Sri Lanka and were responsible for that extreme violence? On that note, I will
Thank you very much. And I'll begin the discussion. If you could, thank you for bringing that back on top. Appreciate it.